For most of modern history, inequality was treated like bad weather, unpleasant, sometimes dangerous, but ultimately natural. Something markets would smooth out over time, something growth would fix, something not worth obsessing over as long as the overall economy kept expanding. Then one economist did something deceptively simple. He stopped looking at decades and started looking at centuries. Welcome to the Financial Historian Files, where money, power, and history collide. And nothing is ever as simple as it looks, as this is the story of Thomas Piketty and why his work quietly dismantled one of the most comfortable assumptions in modern economics, that capitalism naturally spreads wealth over time. This is not a story about ideology. It's not a story about left versus right. It's a story about what happens when you follow the data long enough that the usual. This is the story of Thomas Piketty and why his work quietly dismantled one of the most comfortable assumptions in modern economics, that capitalism naturally spreads wealth over time. This is not a story about ideology. It's not a story about left versus right. It's a story about what happens when you follow the data long enough that the usual excuses stop working. Excuses stop working. For most of the 20th century, mainstream economics focused on growth, productivity, output, efficiency. If the pie got bigger, the thinking went, everyone would eventually get a larger slice. Inequality, if it appeared at all, was framed as temporary, a phase of development, a side effect of progress, or a measurement problem that would correct itself. And for a while, history seemed to cooperate. After World War II, inequality fell sharply across much of Europe and the United States. Wages rose, middle classes expanded, home ownership spread, wealth concentration declined. Economists looked at this period and quietly assumed it was normal, the natural outcome of advanced capitalism doing what it does best. But that assumption rested on a very short memory. Piketty's insight wasn't philosophical, it was archival. Instead of starting with theories, he started with records. Tax archives, estate data, income statistics, national accounts. Not just from one country and not just from one era, but across multiple nations going back hundreds of years. And when he stitched that data together, a very different picture emerged. The post-war period wasn't the rule, it was the exception. For most of modern history, wealth had been far more concentrated than economists like to admit. The 19th century, the era of Jane Austen novels and industrial expansion, was not a story of rising opportunity. It was a world dominated by inherited fortunes where capital ownership mattered far more than work. The sharp decline in inequality after 1914 didn't happen because markets suddenly became fair. It happened because capital was destroyed. Wars wiped out fortunes. Inflation erased debts. Taxes rose dramatically. Governments intervened at scale. Equality didn't arrive politely. It arrived violently. And once those forces faded, inequality began doing what it had always done before. It started rising again. This is where Piketty posed his central question, the one that made people uncomfortable. Why does wealth tend to concentrate over time, even in democratic, market-based societies? Not as a moral question, as a mechanical one. To answer it, Piketty made a crucial distinction, one that sounds obvious once you hear it, but changes everything when you actually think it through. He separated labor from capital. Labor is what you earn by working. Wages, salaries, income tied directly to effort and time. Capital is what you own. Assets that generate income simply by existing. Land, housing, stocks, businesses, bonds. And here's the quiet asymmetry at the heart of the system. Labor has limits. You can only work so many hours. You can only increase productivity so fast. Your income rises slowly, if it rises at all. Capital doesn't face those limits. Capital compounds. It doesn't need to work harder next year. It doesn't need to negotiate, retrain, or show up on time. It just needs to exist. This is where Thomas Piketty introduced the idea that would follow him everywhere, often reduced to a slogan and often misunderstood. When the average return on capital consistently exceeds the growth rate of the economy, wealth accumulated in the past grows faster than income earned in the present. That sentence sounds technical, but the reality is simple. If you already own assets, your wealth tends to grow faster than the economy itself. If you don't, you're trying to catch up to something that's accelerating away from you. This isn't a conspiracy, it's arithmetic. And over long enough periods of time, arithmetic wins. Piketty showed that this dynamic wasn't theoretical. It was visible repeatedly across countries and centuries. Before the 20th century, inherited wealth dominated economic life. After the shocks of war and policy intervention, inequality fell. Then, as growth slowed and capital recovered, the old pattern reasserted itself. The data didn't suggest a temporary glitch, it suggested a tendency. And this is why his work landed so hard when Capital in the 21st century was published, because it quietly challenged one of the core stories modern societies tell themselves, that inequality is mainly about effort, skill, or merit, and that markets naturally reward contribution over ownership. Piketty wasn't arguing that markets don't create wealth. He was showing that markets are very good at preserving and amplifying existing wealth, especially in low-growth environments. When growth is high, wages can rise alongside capital. When growth slows, capital keeps compounding and labor gets quieter. This is where the human consequences start to show. Rising housing prices benefit owners, not renters. Stock market gains reward those who already hold assets. Inheritance matters more when returns compound faster than incomes. Opportunity becomes less about talent and more about timing, specifically, whether you were born before or after assets became expensive. Compound interest doesn't care how hard you work. This is also why Piketty unsettled people across the spectrum. For critics, his work seemed pessimistic, too deterministic, too dismissive of innovation and mobility. Surely new technologies, new industries, and entrepreneurship would disrupt old fortunes. And sometimes they do. But Piketty's point wasn't that mobility is impossible. It was that, at the system level, it doesn't cancel out the underlying tendency. Exceptional stories don't define average outcomes. Supporters, on the other hand, saw something else entirely, a long-term map of how money and power interact over time, and how easily comforting narratives form when we only look at short windows. Because if you only study the post-war boom, inequality looks solved. If you zoom out, it looks structural. And this is where the real value of Piketty's work lies, not in the policies people argue about, but in the perspective it forces. Zoom out far enough, and inequality stops looking like a failure of individuals. It starts looking like a feature of how capital behaves when left to itself. What made Piketty's work explosive wasn't just what it showed, it was when it showed it. Capital in the 21st Century was first published in 2013, and it arrived at a moment when inequality was no longer an abstract concept. Asset prices were soaring, wages were stagnating, central banks had flooded markets with liquidity, and yet the dominant story still insisted that the system was broadly fair, that opportunity was alive, that effort would be rewarded, that what people were seeing was temporary. Piketty didn't attack that story head on. He didn't need to. He simply extended the timeline. And that's where things became uncomfortable. Because when you zoom out, you start to see patterns that short-term narratives conveniently hide. You see that long periods of equality are rare. You see that wealth concentration is not an accident, but a recurring outcome. And you see that the forces that reduce inequality historically are not gentle market adjustments. They are shocks, wars, inflation, taxation at scale, political rupture. In other words, inequality didn't fall in the mid-20th century because capitalism matured. It fell because capital was hit hard. This reframing collided directly with the way modern societies like to think about themselves. If inequality is structural, then it's not just about bad actors or poor choices. It's about how the financial system allocates returns over time. And that raises questions people would rather not answer. Who benefits when asset prices rise faster than wages? Who gains when growth slows but returns on capital remain high? Who is protected and who is exposed when the system compounds? Piketty never claimed to have simple answers. What he offered instead was a diagnostic, a long-term X-ray of how money behaves when it accumulates. That's why the backlash was immediate. Critics argued that he underestimated innovation, that new technologies would disrupt old wealth, reset the game, and create fresh opportunities. Others insisted that mobility mattered more than concentration, that even if wealth pulled at the top, individuals could still move up. These objections weren't frivolous. Innovation does disrupt. Mobility does exist. But Piketty's data suggested something harder to swallow. At the macro level, these forces rarely outweigh compounding returns on capital. Exceptional stories don't define the system, averages do. And averages showed that when the return on assets stays high while growth slows, a pattern common in mature economies, wealth quietly pulls away from work. Over time, ownership matters more than contribution. Timing matters more than effort. This is where Piketty's work stops being academic and starts being practical. Because once you understand this dynamic, a lot of modern phenomena snap into focus. Why housing feels unaffordable even when economies grow. Why stock market booms coexist with stagnant wages. Why inheritance is becoming more decisive than income. Why financial freedom increasingly depends on asset exposure rather than career progression. In a low-growth world, capital doesn't need many opportunities to win. It just needs time. This also explains why inflation plays such a strange role in modern debates. Inflation erodes cash and wages faster than it erodes assets. When asset prices rise alongside inflation or faster, inequality can widen even as policymakers claim success. The system looks stable on paper while quietly shifting purchasing power upward. The financial system isn't broken in these moments. It's doing exactly what its incentives encourage. And this is where misunderstanding Piketty becomes dangerous. Too often, his work is reduced to a moral argument, as if he were simply saying inequality is bad and should be fixed. That misses the point entirely. His real contribution was showing that inequality is persistent, unless something actively counteracts it. Markets don't automatically distribute outcomes evenly over time. They distribute returns to ownership. Understanding that doesn't force you into a political position, but it does change how you interpret risk, opportunity, and security. Because if wealth tends to concentrate, then financial education can't just be about budgeting or discipline. It has to include an understanding of how assets behave, how compounding works, and how long-term trends overpower short-term effort. This is the quiet reason Piketty matters. He shifted the conversation from why inequality exists to how inequality reproduces itself. And once you see that mechanism, you start asking different questions. Not how hard should I work, but what do I own? Not is the economy growing, but who captures that growth? Not is the system fair, but what does the system naturally do over time? History doesn't repeat, but capital has habits. And one of its strongest habits is accumulation. Left uninterrupted, wealth tends to gather where it already is. Piketty didn't argue that this outcome was inevitable in a moral sense. He showed that it was likely in a mechanical one. Interruptions can happen, policies can change, shocks can reshape distributions, but none of that happens by accident. And none of it happens just because markets feel like being generous. That's the grounding insight this episode leaves you with. Understanding inequality isn't about resentment or ideology. It's about realism. It's about seeing the financial system clearly enough to navigate it without illusions. Because if you mistake a structural tendency for a temporary phase, you don't just misunderstand history, you misunderstand risk. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers.